Hmm.
Hello and welcome to an EAS Consulting Group webinar on 21 CFR Part 11 and FDA compliance, presented by EAS independent consultant Carolyn Troiano. Carolyn has more than 40 years of experience in computer system validation and compliance in the pharmaceutical, medical device, tobacco, and other FDA-regulated industries. She participated in the drafting of the Part 11 guidance with a group of industry and FDA participants, and she is currently an independent consultant advising companies on computer system validation and large-scale IT system implementation projects. We'd like to thank you for joining us today and want to let you know that we'll have an interactive question and answer session at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to contact our team through our website or by email to trainings@easconsultinggroup.com, and we'll make sure to direct your request appropriately. I'll now hand it over to Carolyn.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Carolyn Troiano, and we're going to be talking about 21 CFR Part 11, FDA's guidance for electronic records and electronic signatures, ERES, for regulated computers, computer systems, and data. Thanks for joining us. This isn't moving. So on Part 1, we're going to cover an overview and then deep into compliance for Part 11, what we mean by GXP systems, FDA regulatory oversight. We'll talk a little bit about computer system validation and how Part 11 fits in with that. Validation planning, execution, maintenance, organizational readiness, good documentation practice, validation policies and procedures. In Part 3, we'll cover waterfall and agile, computer software assurance, CSA, software and medical devices, COTS, cloud, and software as a service. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll talk about data integrity, data lifecycle, data governance, and finally, vendor audit, FDA inspection trends, and industry best practice. We'll finish with a Q&A and any follow-up items. So we'll start with 21 CFR Part 11. It's a section of the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. It sets forth the FDA's guidelines on using electronic records and signatures. Part 11 essentially allows any paper records to be replaced by an electronic record and allows any handwritten signature to be replaced by an electronic signature. Now, the guidance was prepared with assistance from industry representatives. The goal was to protect public safety, but to do it in a cost-effective manner. And I remember in the 90s, everyone wanted to go paperless. It was the mantra of the 90s. And to do that, people were confused as to if they had electronic record and signature capability, what would they do? What does that animal look like? So the idea is they knew there were going to be additional compliance requirements. They weren't sure what they were going to be at first. And at first, they actually thought that the operational efficiency they gained was definitely worth the cost of compliance. And going into it, everyone was very ready to go. It went into effect in August of 1997, and it defines criteria required by FDA to make sure your electronic records and signatures are trustworthy and reliable, and that your signatures electronically are the equivalent of your handwritten signature. And they provide some definitions. An electronic record is simply any combination of text, graphics, data, audio, pictorial information, anything represented in digital form that you create, modify, maintain, archive, retrieve, or distribute using a computer system. The electronic signature is a compilation of specific symbols, when executed, become the legally binding equivalent of your handwritten signature. They're used to verify the identity of the signer and the intent of the signing. The integrity of the data, document, or record is confirmed. So the regulation actually raised more concerns about potentially restrictive use of technology. They felt that the cost of compliance was overwhelming. Industry concerns and confusion about the applicability, the implementation, the enforcement. So FDA did come out with some additional guidances, but really it didn't help much. Scope and application guidance was issued in 2003. Some of the aspects actually contradicted the 97 rule. In 2010, when FDA realized a lot of companies were not using ERS technology capability. And they were really puzzled as to why they were not doing this. And the main reason was that companies with a very compliance mindset, they were used to doing things a certain way, and they were not able to really understand what the guidance was asking them to do. And one of the important things about FDA is they will tell you what is required. They will never tell you how to meet the requirement. And what you need to know about Part 11 is whatever FDA requires for you to have with a paper record or a handwritten signature, the FDA requires exactly the same what for electronic records and electronic signatures. So what is required is the same. It hasn't changed. How you implement or meet the requirement is what's different going from paper to electronic. Now, a lot of software instrumentation equipment vendors falsely claimed their products. They say we're Part 11 compliant or we're FDA compliant. And that can't be true. They can never, ever deliver a product that's already compliant. They can only provide you with a system that has features and functions that support your ability as a client to validate the system in compliance with Part 11. But the client company, the user of the system, must validate the software. And the subject matter experts, the functional users, are the ones who have to perform the user acceptance testing. Now, Part 11 is a law, and it ensures, and this is really putting it all in a nutshell, you assure that an organization defines the criteria under which the electronic records and signatures are considered accurate, secure, authentic, trustworthy, reliable, and confidentially if personally identifiable information is involved. And I put this slide together because it really gives you a snapshot of how to approach validation and look at the Part 11 components of it. So I usually have a subset of the requirements for any system using Part 11 has to meet Part 11 compliance. I have a subset of requirements that include these particular attributes that have to be met. The acceptance criteria in the middle column is simply what is stated from the FDA. And certainly if a company wants to change the language or do anything, as long as it falls within what the FDA is asking for, you'll be fine. The controls in the third column are all the technical and or procedural controls that must be in place or typically are in place to meet that requirement. So for accurate, data has to be correct, exact in all details, free from error, in accordance with fact and truth. That means if you have database records, structured data, you have an audit trail on it, meaning you cannot make a change without a record of it. If it's unstructured data, like a Word document, PDF, Excel, or any kind of unstructured format, then automated version control is required to make sure that you capture any changes. Now, secure, it has to be free from risk or harm, but there are ways to do that. And role-based access is one. Access should always be role-based, never name-based. Users should be qualified to perform the role they're assigned, and the role should come with a set of access privileges that enable the user to perform the role, not to do anything beyond that. There should be antivirus and anti-malware software in place, and that can be verified. Firewall should be in place, and encryption for transmission, and security monitoring should be going on. So some of these things in the control section can be tested. Some of them are things to verify. And data, real or genuine, true and or accurate. So basically, people have to contemporaneously record information at the time an event happens or an activity is performed. So there can be user authentication and access to support this. Audit trails and version control again. Trustworthy of confidence, dependable. That means you've tested it thoroughly. You tested all aspects of data flow. So for example, any workflow has to be tested end to end because it's an intended use of the system. And you may do multiple rounds of testing or more robust testing for requirements that mean that if the requirement's not met, there may be a high potential risk if it isn't. And if it's a high risk, you want to make sure you test it more robustly. You might do positive test scenarios, but also negative scenarios. making sure the system doesn't do what it's not supposed to do. You might also do challenges to boundaries and stress testing. Reliable, suitable, fit, and fit for its intended use. And this is where the subject matter experts must define the requirements. They must define their intended use and the test scenarios they come up with to show how they would be using the system in day-to-day operations, the workflow, and thoroughly test that in a simulated production environment according to defined procedures. And confidential, if you do have confidential information, then there are things like the General Data Protection Regulation for if you have data from a person who resides in the European Union, or it could be HIPAA, Health Information Portability and Accountability Act in the US if the person resides in the US. And there are a lot of laws within California for California privacy requirements. So depending on where the person lives, whose data, personally identifiable data you hold, you must adhere to whatever local laws exist. Now, General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, HIPAA, CPRA, California, there are actually more than 700 privacy laws in place globally to do this. The key takeaways are quality and compliance have to be built into your program to lead to inspection readiness, meaning you do things right the first time as much as you can. Think about also how would you treat compliance with paper systems before you take action with ERES. Remember, what is required is exactly the same. How you meet the requirement is what will be different. And for every record that is required to be maintained under predicate rules, you want to determine in advance if you're relying on electronic or paper as the source for decision making. People should be making decisions from the system of record. And so you don't want a case where someone is supposed to be working from an electronic record on screen to make a decision. They print out a copy and then they tell somebody, yeah, I just made the decision from the paper. It's true that you could make the copy on paper a true copy, but that's an awful lot of work to do to document that and put that in the file. It's easier to make the decision directly from the system of record. The determination of this should be documented in an SOP, for example, a functional user guide, and it should be included in training so people know how to do this. You may also want to discuss with a vendor a range of features that should be in place to help you manage electronic records and processes. That's where the vendor can provide features and functions that support Part 11, but they will never provide you with a compliant software package. So you have to have assurances for things like audit trail functionality for database records, identity management and assigned roles, segregation of duties, physical and logical security, data integrity, backup, restore, and archive, file format and record retention, system change control, training, FDA inspection and audit. So with an audit trail, you always know who did what action and when. The records are created, modified, deleted, deactivated, or changed. You want to know when that happens, who did it. And you also want to record the events with the exact username, the date, and the time. So that gets pulled from the system through your authentication and through the date and time stamp. Now, if you have a date and time stamp, if you are using a server that's either on premise or in the cloud, generally the date and time are synced up with standard meridian time, Greenwich Mean Time. If you are using a legacy system in a laboratory or a manufacturing area, and you have the software loaded onto a desktop or a laptop to work with an instrument or a piece of equipment, then the software is going to get the date and time directly from that device, the laptop or desktop. So you want to make sure you lock down the ability of anyone to change the date and time on the device. That should not be allowed. You also have to enter a reason for the change. And typically people would have some kind of free text box, but I prefer a drop-down menu with some selections because then later on you can actually go do some trending to find out, if a whole bunch of records were changed and all of them, the reason was something related to training, you know you have a training issue and you have to do some kind of training to remediate that. So the reason for the change, it can be just a simple text box, but it's preferred that you do some kind of drop down menu because that's more beneficial to you as an organization. Now, Part 11 was intended to provide fraud detection, and no when changes have been made. That was one of the impetuses for FDA actually embarking on this. In the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of companies started using contract laboratories, and some of those contract laboratories were not above board. They actually did what we call dry labbing, where they didn't do the work. They simply reported fake or fabricated results to the client. And many people went to jail for that. And as a result, that's when they started looking at ways to do fraud detection and prevention. So the audit trail lets the FDA review your system and have proof of everything that happened chronologically. You want to prevent users from ever being able to modify or delete any audit trail, even the super user or system administrator. You can deactivate it according to FDA. But you have to have documented justification. And honestly, I've never seen anyone deactivate it for a good reason so far. But that is a possibility. Never, ever delete an audit trail. You also want to make sure the system is synchronized by date and time and prevent users from ever being able to change the date or time on whatever device the software is getting the date and time stamp from, including time zone, year, month, day, hour, minute in the timestamp. And for legacy systems, if it's installed on a local device, you have to completely lock down the ability to change that. Identity management and assigned roles. So this identifies who reviewed or approved or did something to the data. Access should be role-based, never name-based. Access privileges should be assigned, but must be limited to only the access privileges required to perform the authorized role. And the person performing this authorized role should have qualifications on file, resume, CV, training records to support the fact that they are qualified. And there are a lot of different ways to comply with this. You can have biometrics, fingerprint, retinal scan, digital signatures, scanning, handwriting capturing software. You can have a user ID and password be your way of identifying somebody. Segregation of duties has to be clearly defined. There have to be separate roles and actions defined. And this should be something that makes sure no one is reviewing or approving their own work. So the audit trail should identify the unique set of user credentials for each action taken on a file. Security, you want to restrict access to systems and data from via external software applications by encrypting the data as it's being transferred using a firewall. You also want to have a cumulative record of every person, authorized personnel, their titles, and a description of their access privileges for everyone who was authorized to use the system. And the cumulative record is important. If somebody were to leave the company, you still want to keep their information around. So you deactivate their account, never delete it. And that way, if a question comes up about some work they did after they've left, you can at least authenticate and tie it to that person having been the one who did the work. And you never, ever want to recycle a user ID. You want to prevent and detect and mitigate effects from viruses, malware, ransomware, all the good things that you have to make sure are not happening. Now, you can apply a number of levels of security if you are wanting to ensure authenticity a little further, but that's going to require extra key clicks by the user. So it's really a matter of whether or not they can tolerate the additional work. If it's going to take too much time or be too much of an inconvenience, they may balk at that. But note that the FDA doesn't require two-factor or multi-factor authentication. So it's up to each company to decide whether or not they want to do that. Now, data integrity controls. These are the features or functions that a vendor can provide to make sure that you're able to make the system Part 11 compliant. You can have prompts, flags, and other features encouraging consistent use of terminology, kind of corralling the user and forcing them to enter in a certain format or a certain length of the entry. There are many ways to do that. And you also want to make sure you have specified valid and invalid ranges where someone is entering data so that the user is prompted that data is out of range. When data is out of range, you have to decide, are you going to use it or are you going to exclude it from your results and calculations? And if so, you have to have a justified reason and it must all be documented. But in the end, you have to still include that data in your package. You can't just throw data away. One of the things FDA has been finding on inspections is they're going through operational areas and looking in trash bins. They're also looking in recycle bins. They're finding raw data thrown away. They're questioning and citing companies for doing that. You also want to make sure that you have specific character types or numbers or format to assist users so that they're forcing them to enter something in a certain way. And you also want to force a valid entry in a field, making it a required field, something the user cannot bypass. Never allow the system to automatically enter default data if a required or any field is bypassed. Now, required field by definition, you can't bypass it, but any field that they can bypass, you don't want the system putting in what they think the user should have said. You also can allow the system to populate one field with data duplicated from another field, but you have to do an analysis and look at the potential risk to the data if you were to make that type of a change or do that type of addition. You want to design the system so that every record is attributable to a uniquely identified person. Be able to reconstruct source documentation for FDA review. Be able to carefully describe to FDA how data was obtained and managed over its life cycle. You also want to make sure you document the hardware and software used at the time. And you can have a hybrid situation for electronic records and signatures. In this case, you would simply have handwritten signatures executing to execute electronic records. So you would print out the electronic record, you would compare it against the screen, print out against the screen, verify it's a true copy, initial and date it, and then you would sign it, scan it back in, and the PDF would be your signed copy. But you have to verify every step of the way. And there should be documentation to show that, and it should be in your procedure as well. For backup, restore, and archival, you want to use a full backup recovery system to protect against data loss. You have to test that backup and restore functionality during validation, and also consider archival for data that doesn't need to remain online, but it's still under retention. We have high volumes of data, for instance, with chromatography data. You might not keep everything online. You might archive some of it, but you're always able to pull it back and it's still under retention. You want to make sure the backup system maintains data integrity. That means it's not just the backup of the data, it should be the backup of the metadata as well. Metadata is what puts it into context. So metadata could be something like an audit trail. Metadata could be a tag for a document. There are many ways you can do that. And you want to store any backup records, if they're physical, at a secure offsite facility, and maintain the backup and recovery logs to show every time you backed up the system and recovered any kind of data, restored any kind of data. And you also should have or make sure that you test that during validation. You try and recover data that has been put out in backup, be able to bring it back in. With record retention, file format, you want to treat the electronic record as a source document and retain it this way according to the retention period. Same retention period, whether it's paper or electronic. You have to make sure you preserve the meaning and content of the record. That means all the metadata to put it in context. You should preserve copies in an appropriate format. XML, PDF, hard copy are the easy ones. You want to make sure it's in human readable format for inspection by FDA. something that they can not only read, they can decipher it. It's not going to be cryptic. And with change control, you want to make sure that you maintain data integrity when you're changing any component of the system. And by any component, that could mean hardware, software, anything that undergoes formal change control. You want to evaluate the effect of the change before and after. So you would have basically an IT change control SOP is typically what people use. And you would evaluate how effective that change is going to be in the new environment. Make sure you understand the potential impact or potential risk to the validated state of the system before you make a change to it. And then you would want to test that afterward, make sure it's in sync. Knowing exactly what impact a change might make allows you to come up with a set of testing to make sure not only is the change working properly, but you might include regression testing to show it didn't damage anything else in the code. Based on it, you want to determine the type and level of testing to perform based on the risk assessment, evaluating the potential risk, and making sure you have things like regression testing incorporated in it. And again, an IT change control SOP is usually the way to do that. For training, anyone who is developing, maintaining, or supporting a system in a validated state needs to be trained in Part 11 if that's part of the system, if it's a capability in the system. Anyone who performs an authorized role, a user, subject matter expert. And quality needs to play a role as well. When FDA came out with their data integrity guidance in December of 2018, no new requirements were added. They didn't require anything new for industry, but they reiterated and stated all the things that have been on the books for decades that people were not doing very well. They were getting sloppy. And so one of the things that were called out as well was quality not doing enough of of conducting mock audits and having oversight to validated systems. So quality needs to strengthen their role. You want to document the computer education, training, and experience. Anything done by someone should be reflected in their personal records. And training should be done on a continuing basis. As new personnel are coming into the organization, you want to give them the same training that a person who initially got that training received. And everyone involved in validation, whether it's users, technical resources, quality personnel, they should have training in how to do validation according to the way your company prescribes it. For FDA inspection and audit, records subject to inspection according to predicate rules means an investigator has to have reasonable and useful access to the records during an inspection. You can produce copies of records in common portable formats when the records are maintained in those formats. You can use an established automated conversion or export method to make copies in a more common format, but there should be a procedure saying how you do that. The process for copying has to preserve the content and meaning of the record. And if you have the ability to search, sort, or trend Part 11 records, copies given to the agency should have the same capability if it's reasonable and feasible. You want to allow inspection, review, and copying of records in a human-readable form at your site with your hardware following your established procedures and techniques for accessing records. Now, standard operating procedures. There are certainly many standard operating procedures required to support all of the work in validation and maintaining a system in a validated state. But you also want to have several that are very specific to Part 11. One key SOP is the User Administration and Management SOP. The second one is System Administration and Configuration, and the third is Document Control. Now, for user administration and management, creating user accounts, creating account types, security rights, getting those assigned, approving user workgroup security rights, making sure access privileges are limited to what's required to perform the role, deactivate accounts when someone leaves, establish rules for password format and content and frequency of change, and define a procedure for what is it that is your manifestation of an electronic signature? What is the set of cryptic symbols that's going to be used to manifest that? The system administration and configuration SOP is the system configuration settings and the security administration settings. So this is how you configure the system to operate. It should also cover audit trail functionality, change control to design configuration of the system, defining the ownership of the system and system issues resolution. And keep in mind, users are the ones who create documents and data. They are the owners of the documents and data. The people who are doing the care and feeding of the system steward, may come from IT, maybe a vendor, maybe a contractor, but that person is the system steward. And together, the user has to report incidents that happen, but they have to work with an IT organization or a vendor to resolve that. With the document control SOP, this is just basically to have a usage statement, revision numbering, approvals, document numbering, distribution might be controlled, and describing what the record retention is for that particular record, the life cycle of the record. So some questions you might ask to see, are you Part 11 compliant? Who's authorized to input and change data? How do you know who entered data? How do you know which data was changed? When do you lock down data input as final? So for example, someone might key in a value into a field, but until they hit the enter key, they can still backspace if they fat fingered something or entered it incorrectly. Once they enter it, that's when it's final. And you might want to look at some data, the history of the data, how the life cycle is controlled. Is the system validated? Were the requirements met? And can you show me the results of the validation activities, the testing? Are the validation documents locked down in a secure, controlled repository? Validation testing, do the results include predefined acceptance criteria? And then pass fail, signature, date and timestamp, deviation management, and objective evidence. Now, for years and years, we did screenshots. So you, for example, you did some testing and every step of the way, you printed a screenshot, you put your ID number for the protocol on the screenshot along with your initials and date, and you kept all that together. And it got to be very, very cumbersome, time consuming. What I would recommend is, since FDA only tells you you need objective evidence, they don't tell you what that objective evidence has to look like or how you have to get that objective evidence. So instead of a screenshot, what I would recommend is doing an audio video recording of the testing. If you're going to sit down and you're going to do an operational qualification test or a performance qualification test, also called UAT, user acceptance testing, you might start an audio video recording, and then you can introduce yourself. You can say what protocol you're working from. You can talk about the various scripts that you're going to be covering, and then you can walk through each one. Everything's captured on the screen in a recording file. The recorded file is what is your objective evidence. It should be locked down, password protected, and you should have it in a secure, controlled repository. Page printouts with a link to source of the generated output, that's also another possibility. Keep it simple. And we all know GXPs. X is a variable where we have manufacturing, laboratory, and clinical operations, all under the predicate rules from FDA, which are the foundational rules. So even despite validation and Part 11 compliance, you still must meet the predicate rule requirements. FDA operates on some key premises. If you didn't document something, you didn't do it. You get no credit unless you have objective evidence. And if you could have committed fraud, you did commit fraud. So even an opportunity to commit fraud, say you have a database record and you don't have an audit trail on it. In that case, you have an opportunity to obscure the original value by making a change, and you are definitely having an opportunity to commit fraud. And while it might not be intentional, you did commit fraud in the eyes of FDA. There's no recourse with FDA. The following notion does not hold up with the FDA, that you're innocent until proven guilty, like you would be in the US court of law. You are guilty until you prove your innocence through your objective evidence and documentation. They can issue fines, confiscate materials, shut down operations, and Schering-Plough is the pharmaceutical, is the consent decree poster child from 1998. This is 25 years ago, and it cost them $500 million in fines. They had to shut down more than one plant, and it took them 10 years to recover, if you could call it a recovery. They became so vulnerable that Merck Sharp and Dohme overtook them in 2010. So you see what an impact that can have on the bottom line. So whether it's an IT or automated system, if it touches your product, meaning you're using it to collect, analyze, report, transmit, otherwise process data, you want to make sure it's validated according to the agency requirements. And it must be maintained in a validated state through the system's life. These are just examples of many of the systems you have in your organization that are GXP. But note the interfaces and points of integration are important. If you have, for example, a LIMS in a quality lab, and you are reporting out data to be sent to production, maybe you have an ERP with a production module, and you're sending over the decision that the raw material meets specifications, production can now use it in their production effort. In doing that, the LIMS would have to be validated. The ERP module that you're sending to would have to be validated. You have to make sure it's segregated from non-GXP modules like accounting or HR. And then you'd also have to test that the interface is working properly. So companies have many good reasons for meeting compliance guidelines. You want data integrity, product quality, customer safety, but you also gain efficient business operations because you're doing things right the first time, avoiding unnecessary time and effort to fix things that weren't done right. You'll promote good relations with FDA, other regulatory agencies as well, and you'll have a positive company image and reputation out there. Now, note if you get a Form 483 citation during an inspection, the FDA.gov website doesn't keep a copy of every Form 483 that's issued. But you can get a subscription to every copy from different providers on the internet. Now, the warning letter, which is an escalation from a 483, and a consent decree, which is another escalation level, those are on the FDA.gov website in full. So you could, for example, download a fiscal year's worth of warning letters from FDA.gov and then go through that and actually click on and see the actual letter. So your competitors and customers can see that. Now, regulatory oversight, there are trends, and it's important to kind of follow them if you can, but there are so many factors involved, it becomes difficult sometimes. But here, this is just an example, and I know it's an outdated slide, but it shows that there is a peak going down, a dip, another peak, and another dip. And this is for Form 483 citations for the pharmaceutical industry. But you see the same trend for medical device industry. 483 citations. Again, you have that pattern of decreasing, increasing, decreasing. So it does have some rhyme or reason to it. Now, the FDA guidance for computer system validation is also called the Blue Book. And the reason it was issued in 1983, there was no internet back then. So it was issued on paper, and the paper happened to be blue. So they called it the Blue Book. But they said very succinctly, it's a process of assuring a system does what it purports to do. It has been thoroughly tested and validated to prove it. What it purports to do is your requirements. And one important subset of your requirements has to be 21 CFR Part 11 compliance requirements if you're using that capability. It's based on a system development life cycle methodology, but the SDLC is just a generic framework. It just means following the system from cradle to grave, making sure the entire life of the system it's under control. So what does FDA require? Because again, they will tell you what is required, but they will never tell you how to meet the requirement. And whether you're dealing with paper or electronic records, the what is the same. The how is what is going to be different. So you have to prove the system does what it purports to do and has been thoroughly tested to prove it. That's meeting requirements. Every requirement must be met. You also have to show it's suitable for its intended use and has been thoroughly tested. And that's where the subject matter experts come up with these scenarios for testing that reflect their day-to-day use of the system, any workflows, any intended use of the system. If you have the workflow involved, you must test it from end to end and not each part discretely. You have to use a risk-based approach. In the early 2000s, FDA recognized they couldn't possibly investigate or audit every single system at every company. These things were mushrooming out of control. So they said they're putting the onus on industry to take a risk-based approach and also be able to identify the risk overall for any system. And what they want you to do is create a GXP system inventory. If they're coming out to do an audit, they might ask you for your GXP system inventory. And at the bare bones level, it's simply one column of your system application name. And the second column would be the risk rating you assign to it when you're doing validation work. Now, risk is something that some people can take to an extreme. You want to be wary of that. You want to be careful so that you're doing due diligence, but you got to realize this is a very subjective type of opinion. Everybody perceives risk differently, and don't get stuck in the mud where people are arguing about whether a risk rating should be 7 or an 8 or 3 or 4. So I generally use high, medium, low, a qualified scale, because people can see the difference between high and medium and low, and you can gain consensus. If you get into numbers, a lot of times those meetings will drag on and drag on. And I had one case where it went 6 weeks before everybody could agree to what risk rating should be assigned. You also have to make sure the system's maintained in a validated state under formal change control. How you do that is through your SOPs. And then companies have to determine how to validate a GXP system. There is no prescriptive method for doing this, and FDA is not going to tell you how to do it. And that's part of the problem with Part 11. Companies in the 90s decided that they were going to go paperless, but they thought that FDA was going to give them a prescriptive method for how to meet Part 11 compliance. And the FDA is not in that business. They instruct you as to what is required. The same what is required for paper or electronic. And people have known what that what is for many decades. So companies have to figure out how to validate it when it goes from paper to electronic. A lot of myths that are dispelled. If you think about industry, in the 1980s, when the Blue Book came out, most companies were using homegrown software developed by an IT organization for that company. A small contingent of IT people generally supported a group of life science users. Now, keep in mind, the FDA doesn't tell you what is required, but will never instruct you on how to do it. There's no published prescriptive stepwise approach to validation that FDA endorses or condones. And a company isn't required to follow any particular SDLC. If you're doing development, testing, validating, you can follow a waterfall approach or you can follow an agile approach, as long as you can defend the work you're doing and that you are meeting the what, meaning you tested every requirement is met, you tested system is suitable for its intended use, you took a risk-based approach, and you maintained it in a validated state. Now, FDA also doesn't require you to follow GAMP5 or any other published principles or practices. Although these are out there, they're very useful, and there's no reason not to embrace them, but FDA doesn't require it. So back in 1983, they didn't require any of these things. So you want to make sure you understand that. A lack of guidance for a technology doesn't mean you can't use it. So right now, there is no specific guidance from FDA on cloud, software as a service, automated testing, AI, et cetera. Now, AI is a little bit of an exception because they are coming out with some kind of guidelines when you're using AI for medical devices. But generally, unless there's some specific need, the technology itself is not something FDA will tell you how to comply with FDA for 21 CFR Part 11 or even just validation. The requirements also, and this goes back to 1983, at the time with homegrown code, most of the people were working hand in hand. The users frequently went into the IT people and said, I want to change that requirement, or can you add this requirement? And it got to be to the point where here is an IT organization trying to develop something and the design keeps changing. So they put their foot down, and as a best practice back in the 1980s, it became a standard that the users had to approve the requirements before turning them over to IT to do design and development work. But it became rigid that people thought that was an FDA requirement. Whatever was required because of the technology at the time, the capability at the time, or the way things were done at the time, a lot of that became thought to be something FDA required, but they didn't require it. And also design configuration specifications. So the requirements tell you what the software is doing, what the system is going to do, purports to do. The design specification for coded software or the configuration management specification for configurable software, these are generally the ways of solutioning the what. So it's how you respond to the what that's required in the requirement. The solutions are generally, in today's world, vendor documents. Back in the day, you were able to sit with an IT person and even walk through some of those specifications, and they could explain it to you, or at least indicate that for every requirement, there was some sort of design configuration spec to support it. But today, most vendors are not giving these documents out, and you may not be able to review it. But that's fine. It's not a requirement as believed by many people, because back in the day, it seemed to be a requirement and people can't get out of the way of doing things. But the design configuration specs, if you have application software that you load onto your infrastructure, your hardware operating system, your application software package, once you validate it, it gives credence to the underlying design. So you may not have the design configuration spec, but if you install it and you test it and it's working properly, the underlying design by default is confirmed. So vendor also, again, cannot claim a system is FDA compliant, validated, Part 11 compliant. Client itself, the client company must do that work. Now, GAM5, category 3, this is software that's plug and play out of the box. You use it as is. You can't configure the functionality, and it has no custom code. Category 3 software has to be validated. Now, many people started, I don't know, in the last 5 years, there seems to be a trend of people using COTS, computer off-the-shelf software, category 3 software. They're not validating it. They're thinking it doesn't need to be because the vendor tested it thoroughly. That's not the case. And regardless of what testing the vendor does, you still have to validate it. In CSV, CSA, neither of those mean any particular methodology for development, for testing, for validation testing. There's no particular methodology associated with either one. They're validation methodology agnostic, platform agnostic, and validation tool agnostic. So just not to confuse those. Now, documentation that you get from a vendor could be leveraged, and it should be leveraged in any case if you can talk to the vendor and understand what level of testing they do. Now, the vendor can provide a set of requirements. If you're buying an application software package and you don't have your requirements done, the vendor may provide that. But you can't just take it at face value. You have to go through it. You have to determine whether those, in fact, are the requirements you agree with. And then you have to do some vetting with your users and come up with what you think is your set of requirements. The vendor, in many cases, doesn't provide enough detail. So you may have to break down whatever the vendor gives you into more granular actual requirements. Now, the vendor can also give you some test scripts. They may give you test scripts that you can execute manually, or they may put an automated test script in your test environment that you can run. But in either case, again, you can't just take it at face value and use it. You must vet it. You have to go through it. You have to make sure that every requirement that you finalized in your requirement set is being tested thoroughly. and that every requirement has one or more test scripts associated with it. And also, when you're doing your requirements, you should be looking at the potential risk if the requirement is not met. And again, do a ballpark, it's a subjective opinion. You want to make sure you have something in place. That's why I use high, medium, low. It's a little bit easier to understand and work with. So take those requirements and do the risk assessment as you take them from the vendor and you convert them into your own document. You'd want to make sure risk is accounted for. And then based on the potential risk of each requirement, you would do a certain level of testing. More robust testing if the risk potential is high, if the requirement is not met, and less testing if it's less risk involved if it isn't met. You can never point to the vendor. I had a case where in a very large organization, people were putting in a clinical trial, electronic trial master file system, an ETMF. And they basically took I don't think they even took the requirements from the vendor. They took the test scripts from the vendor and they were going to execute them manually, but they were going to use that as their form of training. So not only were you executing the test scripts, but you were getting your training at the same time. And there's so many things wrong with that on so many levels. You have to have the requirements first to know that your testing is sufficient. You have to have the test scripts vetted by people to know they're appropriate. And then you should be trained in how to use the system before doing any testing. You can't take things at face value, but that's what that company did because they wanted to get up and running fast. And the vendor caught on to that and provided them with this easy way to do it, but it's not really compliant. And you can't feign ignorance. You can't point to an IT organization. Business unit is the functional owner of the system. They own the system and are responsible for it and must answer to FDA, not the IT organization. Now, one of the failings in the last 4 decades has been a lot of IT organizations, contractors, vendors don't have adequate training in compliance for FDA, in GXPs, in validation, Part 11, data integrity. They just don't have it. And it becomes extremely difficult because then how do they know how to maintain the system in a validated state if they don't know what's required for them to do? So I encourage people to get those people trained, even if it's a simple 1 or 2 hour webinar where they can learn what system maintenance means in an FDA world. FDA will ask the system owner to defend the case for an adequately validated system. And who should care about all this? It's a lot of different stakeholders, anybody involved in validation. You want to have people who are developing, configuring, testing software. Maybe it's a vendor, maybe it's somebody internally. You want to have people who are maintaining the system. And typically that's an IT system steward, somebody assigned to do that role. And you have maybe somebody from the business as well. Users, functional experts, the ones who come up with the requirements, come up with the test scenarios, and are going to use the system on a day-to-day basis. But then your quality auditors, they have to have oversight to the validation work that's done. In particular, you want to make sure that your system validation meets Part 11. You want quality auditors who can go in and look at the fact that you have a subset of requirements to meet Part 11, and you've done the appropriate testing to meet that. Now, the SDLC, it's basically a framework. It supports any kind of validation. It's integral to CSV or any methodology you use for development, testing, and validation. It's a framework. And it includes a series of phases because you're controlling the system through its life cycle. So here you would see the life cycle framework when you're in maintenance mode or production on the left-hand side. At that point, your system is validated. It's in production. It must go under formal change control. And there has to be an IT change control SOP to support it. You have to formally request a change made to the system. And the formal request should include the impact on the validated state of the system if you were to make the change. What impact would that have? And then recommendation for appropriate level of testing. You might test what was changed, but you might also do regression testing. So the change control is extremely important, and that should be documented in an SOP. The change should include the record of the change, code or configuration setting, who implemented the change, the date and time it was moved to production, and the fact that thorough testing was done before doing so. And that should be documented. So let's look at part 2. Here we'll talk about validation planning. We'll talk about validation execution, maintenance, organizational readiness, good documentation practice, policies and procedures. Now, once a system's selected, you want to have a strategic approach to the validation. Is there an overall company approach? What rationale will be used? What SDLC phases and steps? Who's involved? Who's going to do the testing? How is it going to be done? How are you going to get the documentation and the approvals? Questions, questions, questions. Also, are you going to do any business process reengineering? One of the biggest gaps that I've seen over the years is that companies don't do a very good job of business process mapping, reengineering. So they go on these exercises where over a 1 or 2 year period, they're fiendishly going at it, trying to get the business process mapped and come up with the final mapping. But nobody ever owns that document. They never assign ownership. No one is in charge of making sure it's kept current. They put it up on a shelf, and then maybe 5 or 10 years later, they're doing the same thing over again. And it's a waste of time. The business process map gives you so much more information that can be valuable when you're putting a system in place. You also want to know, is the system going to be integrated with a legacy system that isn't validated? In that case, you may have to validate one that you have. Also, organizational change management. This is important because people may be trained, but are they going to embrace the changes and do that in a way that you expect? In some cases, with Part 11, a lot of people didn't like the idea of electronic records and signatures. They still wanted a printout in front of them to make decisions. They still wanted to get in the workflow the opportunity to review and approve things they had done for years. I had a case where there were documents that were signed, reviewed, and approved by 12 different people when they did it on paper. When we converted them to electronic, only 3 signatures were required. And it was quite a job to get the people who were now no longer in that workflow to understand that it didn't mean they were being phased out as far as being employees. Their job wasn't going away. How you get them to understand what the change means, what impact it's going to have on their day-to-day life, and how they can benefit from it. Policies and procedures, they all have to be evaluated, updated, remediated, or created as necessary. If you don't have an SOP for how to handle Part 11 records, you might want to create an SOP for that. And how is training going to be incorporated into the project? Are you going to transition the system? How are you going to do it? Transition it into production? How are you going to maintain it in a validated state? So the SDLC gives you some key elements, but it goes back to 1983 when everything was done in a waterfall approach. Everything was phased. So you started with your validation plan, you had that approved, and then you went in and did your requirements. The URS at a high level business terminology, what the user wants to do. Functional requirements is where you break down the URS elements into granular FRS elements. The URS and FRS together are the what the system purports to do. The design spec, configuration spec is how it's delivered or solutioned, and then you implement. And based on the GAMP5 category, you may do more or less testing. The IQ, installation qualification, verifies the underlying design. The OQ verifies the requirements are met. The PQ verifies suitability. And again, that's also called user acceptance testing. You might have one summary report for all 3 phases, if you can discern each phase as you're reading it, or you may have one report for each phase. And then ultimately a validation summary report. And that tells you whether you did things to plan or if you didn't, what you did and how that worked out, how you resolved any issues, and be able to conclude that the system's in a validated state. Now, back in the day as well, when you had IT people developing software for the user group, the IT people were tired of the users complaining that what they gave them wasn't what they asked for. And that was constant. What the IT people did was they came up with this idea of a system acceptance report saying, you're the owner of the system. You tested this part of it or this module. You need to sign off and say you did the testing, you did thorough testing, and you believe the system is in a validated state. So they were kind of pinning down the client. It's not an FDA requirement, but it's certainly something that can help. System notification, there should be some type of communication indicating the system is now available for production. And we see the GAMP 5V model. We see how we plan things. In the upper left, the URS FRS, what the system purports to do, the design or configuration spec, how that's solutioned, and then you build the system and you install, do OQ and PQ to prove it's working properly, and ultimately you report out. And there are 5 key factors to consider in the validation plan itself. So you're going to have an approach to testing. The type and level of testing is really based on 5 key factors that should be talked about in your validation plan. And it can be very minimal text. You don't have to go into lengthy paragraphs about it. But the first 3 are very subjective and need to gauge resources, needed to gauge resources and time to have robustness of testing based on risk. How big is it? The size, the complexity, the business criticality, the GAMP 5 category, and risk assessment. These should be documented in your validation plan. Again, it can be very concise. Now, the first 3 you can deal with, kind of subjectively, is it a big system or little? Complexity, are there multiple functions involved, multiple vendors, multiple interfaces? And business critical, is it something that is going to be tied into a lot recall, for example? The 4th element, the GAMP 5 system category. So International Society of Pharmaceutical Engineering, ISPE, came up with good automated manufacturing practice. GAMP 5 second edition was published in July of last year. And it's an industry think tank, the ISPE. The good automated manufacturing practice is really based on industry best practice. Focus on patient safety, product quality, data integrity, effective governance, scalable approach, able to improve your own compliance approach, improve the efficiency and effectiveness of it, and enable continuous improvement. GAMP 5 concepts can improve your methodology, showing your system is fit for its intended use, built on industry best. This is built on industry best practice, but it's not a prescriptive method. It's pragmatic. It gives you some ideas, approaches, suggestions, tools, and you have to use your own expertise and judgment in order to apply these. Now, when you look at the categories, going from GAMP 4 to GAMP 5, they actually removed category 2. And the things in category 2, which were firmware, embedded software, PLCs, those either were dumbed down to a level 1 or they were more sophisticated and became a 3, 4, or 5. So for category 1, this is database software, it's operating system. When you think about Microsoft Windows operating system, if you install it correctly, you get the right responses during IQ, you know it's going to work properly because it's used by millions, if not billions of people around the world. You do a vendor audit if it's some product that is new to the scene or something that's not heavily road tested. You do an IQ, you'd install it and make sure it is working properly. In category 3, you have COTS packages, computer off-the-shelf software, can't configure the functionality, you can't have any custom code. You audit the vendor, do an IQ and OQ. Category 4 is configured functionality, where you can configure the software to operate the way your process runs. When you do a vendor audit, IQ, OQ, PQ. And with custom applications, that's new code. So you want to do a vendor audit, IQ, OQ, and PQ. You may be the only people using that code, whereas Microsoft Windows operating system might be used by millions. So the level of confidence you have in the product you're installing or working on is going to, the confidence is going to decrease as you go from 1 to 5. In 5, you've got to do the most robust testing. The risk-based approach to validation. In the early 2000s, again, FDA decided they can't possibly inspect every company. And so what they decided to do was put the onus on industry, expect industry to come up with a risk-based approach to doing validation. The risk assessment is done. It should be an IT risk assessment procedure of some sort, an SOP. And the results are typically documented in matrix format. And you're using the likelihood or probability and the consequences or severity of failure to assign a level of risk. You're also going to look at detectability and at mitigation, whether you have technical and or procedural controls in place to mitigate it. Validation plan uses the high-level risk assessment results to drive the scope and extent of rigor of validation activities. So you ask the question, if the system were to fail, what impact would that have on process, product, or patient? And it can fail in many different non-related ways. You only have to come up with a few scenarios where you think possibly the system could fail. And things like it could be a power outage, or it could be a software glitch that's only maybe cosmetic, or a software glitch that's more specific to a business critical function, in which case you'd want to do more robust testing. There's higher risk involved. So ask, what are the functions performed, the data used, what's affected by it, how could it fail, probability of failure, the severity of consequences if failure happened, how likely would you be to detect it? Identify those scenarios, determine these various attributes of the risk scenario, and then come up with some kind of way of mitigation. Maybe you have technical or procedural controls in place that are mitigating the risk, lowering it. But maybe this is an opportunity to work with the vendor and get some more technical controls in place, or put some more procedural controls in place at your operational area. But you want to identify ways to mitigate risk as much as you can. Determine the priority or the risk rating for each system. And a matrix would simply look like this, where you're defining probability on the x-axis, consequences or severity on the y-axis, and you're showing the risk rating. If consequences are high, medium, or low, you see what those values are, what the criteria are that have to be met to categorize it that way. And the same with probability, low, medium, high, you have evidence of the criteria showing how you came about that. And then you'd have this matrix wherever you come up with your rating. Suppose you have a risk rating that's the risk rating is probability is medium, but the consequences are very high. In that case, you would have a high risk rating. So you see where the two intersect, and that would be your risk rating. And again, it's a ballpark, it's subjective. You only have to be able to defend how you did it, explain how you came up with that justification for it. But FDA can still argue with you and contest what you're doing, but at least you show due diligence, you did the best effort you could, and let them come back and say why you should have thought about this other thing, or you should have considered it differently. You want to be able to try and guess ahead of time, if they're coming for inspection, what they might ask you. But as long as you can defend what you did, and you can do that in a very articulate manner with confidence, you'll be in good shape. So you perform the risk assessment also on each requirement. As you're collecting your requirements, look at different scenarios. How could that requirement not be met? What would happen? And if it wasn't met, what would be the consequences of that? Would I know it or would I not know it? Do I have any mitigation, technical or procedural controls in place? And come up with a risk rating for the requirements as well. What FDA has decided too is, in producing the CSA, the Computer Software Assurance Guidance, issued as a draft in September of 2022, they recognized that industry was treating everything equally for the sake of compliance. They wanted to pass an audit, so they tested every requirement to the same degree. In that case, they were doing overkill on some requirements, and others they might have even been short shrifting, and they ended up having blind spots. So FDA said, do what makes sense. I call CSV common sense validation. Do what makes sense. and do it and be able to defend it. You also have to have that system inventory. This is just an example. You might have the system name, the risk rating. You might have a description. You might have business criticality value. Any other information you want to put in here is fine, but you have to at least have them prioritized by risk, with the system having the highest risk rating at the top. So in this case, you would have to reorder that. You would have to put system C at the top, system A in the middle, and system B at the bottom. So we saw the GAM5V model for the typical waterfall approach that was done for homegrown code back in the 80s. You have the user requirements. Again, this is high-level business terminology, what the intended uses of the system. And from that statement, you can draw down to individual granular FRS requirements. The detailed requirements have to be defined and approved. But again, you can approve them as you go. If you're doing an agile methodology, you'll bring a subset of requirements into your first sprint, which is usually a 2 or 3 week effort and duration, and you will do everything for those requirements in terms of design, coding, configuration, installation, operational qualification. At the end of the sprint, you have a working piece of functionality. You then decide you have more requirements, you're going to go back and do a second sprint. And you keep doing that until you run out of requirements, in which point you jump off and do a PQ or UAT for the whole system. So this way you're cycling through these sprints, but it gives you an opportunity to really look at the functionality, the requirements in more detail. You may have changes to them. You may realize certain things are not going to work the way you thought. So it's an opportunity to be able to revise things. Whereas in the waterfall approach, if you're approving everything up front, no one wants to talk about any changes to requirements once you get started. Requirements are what the software does as perceived by a user. You perform an action, you get a response, and you have to agree what that is. And the person who's developing that software should understand that. Requirements have to be unique, uniquely identified, testable, feasible. These are things now, the Part 11 compliance. All those things, those attributes, those requirements, the subset of requirements for Part 11 have to meet these standards. Only include requirements also that represent functionality you're going to use. If you're not going to use a piece of functionality, don't include it, because then you have to do testing for it, and that can be extra work. And when we look at requirements, they start at the very high level business strategy. In this example, they want to automate manufacturing equipment. In the middle, you have your high level URS elements. The user says, I want to press tablets. Well, what does that mean? You break that down into detailed functional requirements and you specify exactly what that means. But don't forget, on the bottom, you have system requirements, non-functional requirements. These are needed for system support and maintenance. They are enablers of functionality. Without them, you cannot use the system. In this case, the tablet press has to operate at a certain temperature range. Otherwise, it's not going to be good to go. You might have security requirements. You might have access levels. All of those are given to a user to enable them to use the system functionality, but in and of themselves don't represent functionality. So a high level allow entry of product information, detailed FRS example, entry of a product number as an 8-character numeric, and many, many more to support that high level URS element. Types of requirements. This is a list to start a conversation. This is some of the areas where you'd find those types of requirements. So it's good for conversation. It's good as a starting point, but there may be others outside of these particular areas that will end up being requirements. You might have Part 11 requirements. You might have data integrity requirements in here. And again, the non-functional system requirements, allowing users to access an application. Other things, performance. Maybe you have to have a certain response time for the user, or a certain capacity of disk storage, or the system has to be available 24/7 or be up 95% of the time. And here you might include some security, data integrity, quality type requirements to enable the system to be used. So again, the top two are the functional, but don't forget the bottom. This is often left out, and there are many citations in industry for people who don't take these into account. It's good to know who asked for a requirement because you know how to put it in context later on if there's a question. And there are key requirements that have been subject of FDA inspections recently: security permissions, error messaging and logging, system shutdown, and overload handling. And these should be tested during validation. The design is how the software responds. So a requirement might be allowing the user to open a data file for which they have access. The design issue is whether you build a customized or use a platform standard file selection tool. So the solution, the how, is what is in the design. Detailed design, again, you may not have these documents. There's something that the vendor will hold and may or may not have them. Now, it was a belief for years that users had to sign off on these documents, but that's not true. It says it in the slide. The slide has an error in it. Users don't have to sign off on them. Testing, IQ for all the components, OQ for any application software, performance qualification, looking at the intended use, and must be executed by users. IQ and OQ can be done by anyone. You want to have a detailed validation test plan. You want to make sure that your requirements are rated for risk and you understand the ones that are higher potential risk if they fail, get more robust testing in the form of both positive and negative scenarios, boundary and stress testing, multiple rounds of testing. Every defect has to be followed up and resolved. Segregation of duties has to be in place. And there should be a summary report for either each phase of testing or one for all three. You can purchase IQ and OQ test packages from vendors, and they can even execute it for you. Anyone can do IQ and OQ, but you have to vet them up front. You have to also have oversight to everything they do. With PQ, on the other hand, while an outside person can do can write the test protocol or the test summary report, they can only do so if they're getting direct user input on the test scenarios. The scenarios and scripts have to come from the users. And PQ must be executed by users. No one outside the organization can do that. It's your subject matter experts that do it. You want to go with a mature vendor, one that is invested in the life science market, one that has a large client base where you can go and get information about how well they are being serviced by this vendor. You want a vendor that has a robust, mature quality management system, how they manage code development and promotion of code, testing of code, and ultimately support. Your test results matrix might look like this, where you have the step number, the description, the expected results. You might add actual results. You might just have a pass-fail, a discrepancy number if there is one, and signature and date. This goes back to the old days, and it's not necessarily something you need to have. You have to have some type of script that tells you what to test, and then you have to have evidence of that, but that could be through an audio video recording. In this case, it just shows that the actual results for the first test script failed, and they signed a deviation number to it because it's something that has to go back to the vendor. It's a script. It's not a script error. It's not a tester error. It's a software error, and the person has to deal with that. You have to stop testing at that point, and you have to go back and have the software remediated. In the second script, you see it passed. Always at the bottom have the acronyms or P or F say what they mean. In this case, the person realized discrepancy number 5 was already used, so it's really 6. And you can see the simple line through, correct it, initial and date, and the reason for it. So every deviation from an expected result, you want to assign a consecutive number, investigate for the root cause, note as a system error. If you have a tester error where the tester did something wrong or recorded it incorrectly, or you have a script error where it was written incorrectly, you can immediately correct it with the reason for the change. Test script error, tester error, and then initial and date, and just keep moving on with your testing. It's only really if you have a system error or defect where you have to stop testing until a vendor or someone resolves it. And you want to record the resolution in a deviation log. So behind your test matrix that I just showed you would be a deviation log where you record each deviation, what scripts are involved, look at the investigated root cause, look at the remediation and the retesting. Everything has to be resolved prior to final review. And with your requirements traceability matrix, again, in the old days, everyone thought design was part of this. And it, in effect, is, but you don't necessarily have to have those design documents. Your traceability matrix, you have to, at the minimum, have every requirement and every test script associated with each requirement. So it's at least a couple of columns. You might have a unique ID number for each and some other information. You'd have the test script written out, and you would be able to execute it for the test results. Then when you put it into your requirements traceability matrix, you're just showing that correlation of R to T. And once the results are approved, you have your RTM approved, a summary report prepared, you can go ahead and do your validation and ending validation summary. So in the test summary report, it should explain when testing was stopped, if it was, detailing the chronological path followed, and the conclusion should be that it's fit for production if it's done right. And once you go into maintenance mode, you have to have all the details, logbooks, electronic files. You have to have system configuration settings. Now, maybe the vendor owns that. They may share it with you or may not. You may have a vendor partner that manages the configuration settings, in which case they would control all of that. Backup, restore, archival, environmental requirements, if they apply. They generally don't, but there could be cases. Security, controls, user guides, incident reporting, some mechanism for reporting, investigating for root cause, remediating, retesting, the policies and procedures needed, change control, system maintenance. If you have preventive maintenance, you need those records. Disaster recovery plan. If it's an on-premise server, your IT organization would be in charge of that. If it's a vendor, you would go to their website and find out what kind of disaster recovery plan they have. Business continuity plan, that's the users determining how they're going to conduct critical business functions in the absence of a system. And then say they put them in an Excel spreadsheet until the system is recovered. And then they would have to have a process for putting that data into the system. Data governance, training, retirement. Disaster recovery is making sure you're bringing back the most critical functions first to be able to resume operations. And again, with cloud and software as a service vendors, you'd have to go to their vendor website and also look at the contract and make sure it's included. Business continuities for critical business functions, able to recover operations. You want to wait until you can recover that particular system. You want to still be able to conduct any kind of business. So things that have to continue. And then once it's in production, you want a governance board. You want to oversee the validated state of the system. Should be organized before you go live with roles and responsibilities. Typically, this is similar to a change control committee or some type of committee that reviews the changes and either approves them or doesn't. And every system has to be retired. If you have expired data documentation, you should dispose of that securely to avoid liability, because the FDA won't cite you for having expired data, but they will have an opportunity to look at that data and criticize it. So don't open up that door. You want to make sure that if data is not expired, you have some way of preserving it. So you either keep the system around, even though it's retired, you only allow view access. No one can change or add anything. And then you can have that until the data is expired. Otherwise, you can move that data, migrate it to another platform, another media, whatever makes sense. There has to be a process defined for that. You also want people to fully embrace the system. So a detailed training plan is important, timing it, making sure, for example, with Part 11, that you're incorporating Part 11 requirements and explaining why certain things have to be done a certain way. This should be documented, should be available, and it should be mandatory and enforced. I had a case where Training was called mandatory training. There were 4,000 users, only 62% showed up. It wasn't enforced. 38% showed up on day one of go live looking for help. So that can put everything into chaos. The organizational change management. You want to identify who's going to champion the system, and then especially find out who's going to obstruct things and try to disarm them. You want to bring these people along through the change. And communication is important and listening is important. I had a case where the one particular business unit didn't say anything as we were putting the system in. We went through monthly meetings, we went through opportunities to give them a voice, and nothing was said. But the system included a time clock, an automated time clock that was controlled with a biometric thumbprint. So now these people had to thumb in and thumb out of the building every day at work. They were not used to that. That was something that they thought was overreach. And so instead of bringing this up during the discussions, the first week of go live, they went out with sledgehammers in the middle of the night and basically destroyed the time clocks, and they had to be replaced. They had to have plexiglass put around them to protect them. It can be extremely daunting. If they do want to obstruct, they will find a way to do it. Organizational change management makes sure people understand, what does it mean when we go with Part 11? It means you're going to have to practice things differently. You're going to have to rely on the system of record to make a decision, for example. You're going to have to look for opportunities for where something might not be in line with Part 11. Knowing the requirements for Part 11 and understanding why they are required is important. Making sure the system is used correctly and allowing users to give you feedback. GXP documents, legal documents, you've got to have these done. And they demonstrate what was done, when it was done, who did it. It's important critical documentation for validation and Part 11 compliance. Also training and skill qualifications. And you want to make sure that your policies and procedures are in place and that you have a way of maintaining the system in a validated state, that original documentation is reviewed by a second person, approved by a third, with segregation of duties for all your validation documents. Deviation from a plan or a protocol, you have to document that, fully justify it. And deviating from a procedure, because it's not updated, is a violation. If a procedure needs to be updated, get it updated before you do the work. If you can't do that, the best you can do is make a note that you are going to, you're in the process of updating it, but decide how you want to proceed because you don't want to be out of compliance. Email is important to look at. A lot of people think this is good documentation. Someone sent me an email saying that they agree with a certain decision. Well, it's not truly documentation. You can't go back to that email and reference it as a formal document. The only thing you can do is if someone sends you an email and there's a decision being made or there's something in there that you want to capture, you have to print it, sign and date it. You can scan it back in. And as long as you're comparing every step of the way, you can even get rid of the paper. But you have to have that hard evidence, not the original email, because that can be doctored very easily. All your policies and procedures should be updated. Create any new ones, do a gap analysis. This is a set of topics that are key for GXP compliance and validation. So it doesn't mean you have to have an policy for each one of these, but you need to call out somewhere how you're going to control. Its policy is high-level directive that if you have a system that's GXP, you must do validation, for example. Or if you have a validated system, it must be under formal change control. Whatever case you want to make for how you want to carve this up or how you want to present it, it's up to each individual company. And this is just a procedure topic list, a set of topics that you might want to cover somewhere. I like to do one validation procedure that covers all aspects, functional requirements all the way through performance qualification. And then you're going to have some procedures related to maintenance, to backup, recovery, archival, release of a system, configuration management, retirement, recovery from disaster, business continuity planning, change control, electronic records and signatures, and data integrity. asset tracking, good documentation practice, training, tracking, and management. So we're going to get through section 3 here, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. So we'll look at the waterfall and agile methodologies and the differences, and we'll talk about CSA and CSV, software and medical devices, COTS packages, cloud software as a service. So agile, again, you break things down into sprints. Usually it's a 2 or 3 week period, but it could be anything you define it to be. And at the end of the sprint, you get a working product. You get functional code that works. You're producing ongoing releases with small incremental changes from a prior release. Every iteration is tested. And the idea of agile is that you get your developers, testers, and customers huddled to be able to do everything together. It depends on heavy customer interaction giving clear direction. And it can be difficult. Scope creep is problematic here, but you have somebody who can control that scope creep. And also any new requirements you come up with in subsequent sprints, you have to make sure it doesn't conflict with the existing architecture. Now, the GAMP5V model, I've mapped it to the agile approach. It's mapped originally for waterfall approach, but you can basically use the same model, only instead of phases in waterfall, in agile, you have sprints that are cycling. The timing, completion, and review might vary. But there's, other than if a validation approach other than waterfall is used, you still have to do a thorough job. Now, GAMP5 second edition, there is actually a special interest group within the ISPE that set forth or is coming up with guidance on how to apply agile development to a GXP system software. The SIG is focused on risk, critical thinking, which is part of what CSA is. And the idea is to remove aspects that don't add value. So you can go to that special interest group, you can look at their white papers, their presentations, and see where they are in terms of defining how to deal with agile in a GXP world. Now, this is what I did for mapping the validation, the V model to agile. You still have the plan, the what, how, build, prove, but you're going to be a little bit different in that you're not going to do one phase completely and then move to the next. You're going to do all the phases for one subset of requirements. So you start with a requirement spec, you pick out a subset. Say you want to do your Part 11 requirements first. In this sprint, you're going to do Part 11 requirements. You're going to do the design, the configuration, the coding, the testing. You're going to install it, do an operational qualification. And then if it's not your final sprint, meaning you still have more requirements, you will go back and get that subset of requirements to do in your second sprint. So with every sprint at the end, you've completely tested that portion. If you're using automated testing, which is very important, you can actually run those automated test scripts continuously. So if you're on sprint 5, the end of sprint 5, you can run the test script for that sprint. But you can also rerun the first 4 and make sure that sprint 5 didn't have an impact on the first 4. When you get to the final sprint, you don't have any more requirements. You can jump off and do your performance qualification on the complete code and then do your validation summary report. It's up to individual companies to decide how they're going to do this, how they're going to create and amend different deliverables, but don't try to force fit the waterfall documentation into an agile methodology, because you're putting a square peg in a round hole. You have to come up with the best approach for doing this, and you have to use common sense. So you see, this cycle is similar to the phases, only you're going to keep recycling over and over again, doing these tasks for each cycle. Do what makes sense, use a risk-based approach, test requirements according to potential risk if they are not met. If it doesn't seem to add value, if something you're doing doesn't seem to add value, question whether you should be doing it. With CSA, computer software assurance, critical thinking is the key. FDA expects you to ask why you're doing the validation in the first place. And the documentation, rather than driving the process, which it does in waterfall approach, the documentation is just the final proof. rather than the driver of validation. So with CSA, you're asking why software is being developed. You're not focused on the mechanics of code development or the mechanics of creating deliverables. The risk-based approach is required, appropriate testing, and then the documentation. The purpose becomes to prove activities were done effectively. That's what your documentation shows. Critical thinking is your main focus. And also, CSA approach addresses critical thinking and how requirements are classified by risk and tested differently. If you're using cloud services, you can't do a standard IQ. If you're doing an on-premise system, you can do an IQ, you can get your screenshots or do an audio video recording of the installation. In the cloud, you don't have that opportunity. But FDA doesn't tell you how to do it. So what's the most common sense way of doing it? To me, it's do a sort of a reporting exercise. I call it vendor qualification. And I do basically, I take a vendor questionnaire, an IT vendor questionnaire. There are many out on the internet. Grab a generic one, tailor it to questions that are appropriate for your particular vendor that you're looking at, and then go to the vendor's website. Look at their policies, procedures, practices, and certifications. Look through that vendor questionnaire and see if you can come up with answers to everything, how the vendor does those things. Also, you would report that out. You'd have a vendor qualification protocol saying, use the vendor questionnaire, go to the site, get the information. The vendor qualification summary report would be the readout of what you found at that site. Now, automated testing, the documentation is going to be different because automated test tools are self-documenting in most cases. It depends on the tool you're using, but it's important to understand what tool is being used and how it works so that you know how the documentation is recorded. Moving from CSV to CSA means a shift from documentation driving everything to critical thinking being at the front. In some cases, for a low risk requirement, a simple test can be done. If it's a high risk, high impact requirement, you might do some more robust testing. If you're testing a higher level process, you can automatically qualify the underlying system. So don't spend time, you can't qualify servers, operating systems, database setup. These are so heavily used in industry, you know, if you install them correctly, they're going to work correctly. So what's critical thinking? You ask questions, question assumptions, don't take anything at face value. Be aware of your thinking. Try to think of things from different perspectives. And so you want to make sure you've thought about all ways. Evaluate existing evidence. You may have a lot of vendor evidence that you can use. You can't use it per se just as it is and point to it during an inspection, but evaluate what's out there and see how you can leverage it and use it. And remember to think for yourself and know you can't do it 100% of the time. Now let's talk about software and medical devices. So software used in conjunction with a medical device to control or monitor activity. That software has to be validated. The extent of validation evidence depends on the device manufacturer's documented intended use of the software. So a device manufacturer who chooses not to use all the vendor supplied capabilities of the software only needs to validate the functions that will be used, and the potential risk of device failure has to be considered when you're determining the type and level of testing to conduct. When software is upgraded, you have a patch, a change. The device manufacturer should consider how those changes may impact the used portions of the software and must reconfirm validation of those portions. But high-risk applications should not be running in the same operating environment with non-validated software functions, even if those software functions are not used. You want risk mitigation techniques, memory partitioning, other approaches to protect resources. They should be considered. Now, COTS, configurable off-the-shelf software, software vendors test and validate COTS packages, but to meet industry standards, not necessarily to meet FDA standards. So companies are going to decide how they're going to do this. Software vendors test and validate the package for industry standards. You have to take that at not at face value, but decide on how you're going to test it. Don't assume it was done well. You have to validate these to meet FDA standards. And FDA is increasingly concerned that these category 3 packages are not being validated by people. They're simply pointing to the vendor, which is not going to get them very far. COTS application, you want to audit the vendor, you want to review their way of doing methodology, software development life cycle. You want to look at COTS tools. You can't do exhaustive black box testing. So think about what it is you're testing and why you're doing it. Validation of tools may be inferred just by validating the application usage requirements. So these are traceable and indirectly implemented by the COTS tool functions. Software tools are frequently used to design, build, and test the software for an automated medical device. The main compliance-related purpose of validation ensure accuracy and integrity of data. You want to make sure you have validation done as a prerequisite for reliable system operation and uptime. Depending on complexity and functionality, that can be a huge task. Now, with cloud services, things are changing, and I've seen in the last 5 years many companies going to this type of technology. Adoption of new technologies, identifying and mitigating risk are important for public safety. Increasing use of cloud technology has brought this into the mainstream, and it's now a viable and secure option. The approach to validation is going to be a little bit different, and you have to tailor it accordingly. Software as a service solutions, needs for mass processing, management of data, that's escalating. There's increasing demand for scalable, fast delivery solutions while reducing costs. Cost-effective solutions are needed to minimize the IT management and maximum capacity for data and growth. You want SaaS solutions, they fit this model perfectly, but they create concerns about compliance and security related to things like HIPAA, GDPRs, and your California privacy rules and other rules. The key is understanding what the risks are and the technical and procedural controls you put in place to mitigate that risk. With SaaS solutions, you have a comprehensive compliance framework required, view of the intended purpose of the solution and how it's controlled, robust validation strategy. You want a QMS with enterprise-wide controls, secure application infrastructure with encryption if there's PII involved. Maintaining a SaaS solution means a repeatable way to minimize requirement and test tasks. Simplifying validation and maintenance of a SaaS solution means you have to do a risk assessment and have a strong defensive case. The level of testing and documentation is based on the risk tolerance of a particular company, which may vary. Talk to the provider about their responsibilities related to IT and compliance, and make sure you use your contract as a way of securing what you need and holding them accountable. Ultimately, you as a client own compliance. You can only try to get them to do the things that you need. There's an opportunity to streamline requirements if the provider thoroughly complies with regulations. And you also want to make sure any cloud or SaaS provider is SOC 2 certified, SOC 2 certified. That's the current standard for cyber technology. You also want to make sure that wherever your data is stored, you have an agreement with the vendor that if they are going to pull the plug for any reason, that you have at least 30 days notice in order to retrieve your data from the cloud before they pull the plug. So now we can take a quick 10-minute break and come back, and we'll finish up with the last couple of sections. Okay, I hope everybody's back after a nice break. It's been a lot of material, a lot of slides, and I appreciate everybody's patience getting through it all. But we're going to start recording again, and we're going to talk about data integrity, data lifecycle, data governance. And data integrity is very integrated or intertwined with Part 11 requirements, as you'll see. So data integrity requirements for complete, consistent, accurate data, but it goes beyond that. Remember the ALCOA Plus acronym. and make sure you're following this, and even Part 11, because the FDA assumes, or people assume that they can trust the firm to do the right thing when they're not there looking over their shoulder. So if they find things that are issues and they break trust, that's hard to regain once you lose trust. So data integrity and compliance, the guidance came out in December of 2018, but it was nothing new, no new requirements. They simply were restating all the areas where FDA felt that industry was failing. They were doing things sloppy. They were throwing data away. They were not doing the due diligence that they should. And in rushing, human error creeps in. They end up not doing things right the first time. So they restated the parts of 211 and 212 that are being ignored by industry. Your backup data exact and complete, secure from alteration, erasure, or loss, stored to prevent deterioration or loss. Activities documented contemporaneously to the fact at the same time of performance. Lab controls scientifically sound, records or originals or true copies or accurate reproductions. But if you have a true copy, it must be compared against the original. You must initial and date that it is a true copy. And complete information, all data derived from all tests, complete record of all data, complete records of all tests performed. If you are doing testing into compliance where you throw out the data until you get the acceptance criteria met, you're going to be considered as to have committed fraud. So the Alcoa data integrity components and the plus components, attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original or true copy, accurate, complete, consisting, enduring, and available. And just like I did for Part 11, I did a mapping showing what would be your requirement. This is a subset of requirements that I call data integrity requirements. And the requirement is that the data is attributable, it's legible, and so forth. And the acceptance criteria in the middle is taken from the guidance indicating why you have that particular requirement in place. What is the acceptance criteria? And you have to define that for your organization. And then the controls, the technical and procedural controls. Now, if you look at this a little bit more than halfway down, you see accurate. We saw that with Part 11. No editing without documented evidence, and audit trails and automated versioning, same as Part 11. So some of these are intersecting with the Part 11 requirements, but they go a little bit beyond that. You also have to have your metadata in your backup. That could be an audit trail, processing information methods. Static data is your fixed record or printout. Dynamic is when a user is interacting with it. Backup has to be editable data with metadata and your configuration settings. And validation has to include testing of the backup and recovery process. Citations, excluding data from decisions without justifying why, just throwing it out, not putting it in the record, and not investigating and writing up justification for not including it in your results. Workflow, not doing an end-to-end test. You can't just test each part discretely. Access restrictions have to be based on the person's role, and they should not be given more access than needed. Concerns with shared login accounts and passwords, controls not in place for blank forms, audit trails not reviewed. An audit trail should be reviewed with the same frequency and by the same person who would review that information if it were in, say, a laboratory notebook or on paper. And electronic copies have to be compared to paper if you're going to scan them in, if you're going to sign them, print them, sign them, and scan them in. Paper printouts, you have to compare those with the screen copy. And electronic signatures, they have to be defined. What is it that means your electronic signature? And it has to be secured. Your records have to be secured. Here, an example of a laboratory record where raw data wasn't maintained. FDA found the data in the trash. Here's another one, not putting the right controls over who can change master production and control records. Lack of basic controls. Audit trails were actually turned off. There wasn't control over substituting, overriding, deleting data. And people were sharing their user IDs and passwords. People were saying, go in and pretend you're me and do the approval of something. and not really delegating that responsibility to somebody and documenting the delegation of the activity, having them pretend they're you, and that's fraud. Data not secured, data not attributed uniquely to a person. In cases where you may have one login that people use commonly, the same login to get to software. You have to figure out a way to document that you are this person using the system at this time, and you sign in and sign out on paper to show, or in a spreadsheet. You have to show who did what. Data falsified, inaccurate, documentation not done contemporaneously. Someone wrote it on a sticky note and failed to enter it into the system later on, or they transposed numbers and it became messy. Raw data not available. Training file was overwritten. QC created unauthorized computer folders, not under oversight, not recording things when they're performed, not preventing unauthorized access or changes to data, not having those controls in place, testing into compliance, only saving the most favorable result without justification, destroying original records. If you have one piece of data that you collect, it's raw data and it must be preserved. Using sticky notes, capturing original critical manufacturing data, and then destroying them after transcription into batch records. Backdating, forward dating, all of these things are violations. Typical data integrity observations include alteration, fabrication, misrepresentation, omission, deliberate willful deception, fraud, inadequate data or documentation retention practices, questionable, poor, incomplete documentation practice, altering information on a COA. Is QA providing oversight, or is it a symptom of a weak QMS? Why wasn't the issue found early? Why should FDA come in and find things? You should have your quality organization doing mock FDA audits and find out these things before FDA comes in. Typical observations where you have trial injections, results failing, specifications are retested until you get the results you want. Overwriting electronic raw data, out of specification not investigated, controls not established for something, records not completed contemporaneously, backdating, fabricating data, not saving electronic or hard copy data. Making changes to a chromatographic data or injection sequence should be documented in an audit trail. If you abort or have an incomplete injection, that should be captured in the audit trail. It should be investigated and justified. Don't try using pieces of paper to record things and transcribe them later. Not acceptable to store anything without creating a permanent record. And technical and procedural controls have to be in place to minimize risk. Data has to be evaluated by quality against release criteria and maintained. And quality was found to be lacking in their level of oversight. Electronic data has to include the metadata. Invalidating test results means a valid, documented, scientifically sound justification. If legitimately invalidated, you still have to include the invalidated data in your full cGMP batch record. Workflows and intended use has to be validated end to end. The extent of validation should be commensurate with the potential risk posed if the system fails or a requirement is not met. Appropriate controls need to be in place for managing risks. And those appropriate controls mean you want to make sure only certain authorized people can make changes to certain records. You don't want someone able to alter specifications, process parameters, or whatever, unless they are adequately trained to do so and assigned. Authorization to alter files and settings should be done by a system administrator, and the system administrator should never be a user. There are too many cases where FDA is going in and the system administrator is a typical lab user. They may have two different sign-ins depending on the role, but still, it's not independence. Method has to be documented for authorizing access and associated privileges. There has to be a request, there has to be an approval. Blank forms have to be numbered, issued, and reconciled. Incomplete or erroneous forms still have to be part of the permanent record. You can't just throw them out, and you have to have written justification for the replacement. Audit trails reviewed with the same frequency and by the person who reviews it on hard copy. audit trail review at the same frequency. Electronic copies can be used as true copies of paper or electronic records as long as they preserve the content and meaning of the original, which includes all metadata. The metadata is necessary to reconstruct the activity and be able to talk about the static and dynamic nature of them. True copies of dynamic electronic records can be maintained in the format of the originals or a format that preserves the content and meaning if a suitable reader and copying equipment are available. Paper printouts can be retained instead of original electronic records as long as you do the comparison and you initial and date. Paper printout may satisfy retention requirements if it's an original copy or a true copy, provided you retain it for the retention period. If the electronic records are dynamic, getting a printout doesn't preserve the dynamic record format. So that's part of the complete original record. It becomes a GMP record when it's generated. It has to be saved, documented, and saved at the time of activity performance contemporaneously. You can't modify anything without a record of the change. So, chromatographic data saved to durable medium after each step or injection, not at the end of an injection set. Companies cited for performing systemic corrective action, failing to perform systemic corrective action. If you find an issue, you can't just band-aid that particular issue. You have to look widely to see if it's a systemic action or systemic error that has to be corrected in multiple places. You also have to have reasonable, responsive timelines for doing remedial action in response to FDA requirements. Provide objective evidence, provide training for updated procedures, assess all products adversely affected, specifically address violations cited, conduct retrospective reviews, and provide supporting evidence if you disagree with FDA. You have to take a holistic view of deficiencies and act accordingly. There are a lot of different data integrity publications. The MHRA has something, the FDA, the UDRA, the Health Canada has it, the World Health Organization, WHO. So these are all worth looking at if you're operating in under those areas where these agencies are operating. The requirements from data integrity are not new. They are simply restated things that were always required, but people are failing to meet. If you're preparing for inspection, is your software and hardware suitable for the task? Have incidents been recorded, root cause investigated, remediated, retested based on risk? Security monitored. Do you have audit trails reviewed? Is it documented? Are changes done by SOP, formal? Records of all changes, including any kind of enhancement or change to a critical component? And can you show the system's maintained in a validated state? Now we look at the data life cycle. It consists of 7 phases. Each one has its own characteristics. So if you follow a piece of data as it's moved through the enterprise, you would understand the various phases and characteristics. And this is important for Part 11 because you have electronic records and you have a life cycle for those records. Data capture. Data must pass within the enterprise firewalls. Active creating data values that do not yet exist and have never existed within the enterprise. There are 3 ways. You can do it through data acquisition, data entry, or signal reception. With data maintenance, once it's captured, how do you make sure it's being maintained properly? Supplying of data to points at which data synthesis and usage occur. You want processing data without deriving value from it. Often involves movement, integration, cleansing, enrichment, change data capture, and extract, transform, load, ETL. Focus of a broad range of data management activities, and the challenge is rationalizing how data is supplied to the endpoints for data synthesis and usage, because you want to prevent proliferation of point-to-point transfers. Data should be captured once, used many times. Data synthesis, where you're creating data values that are through inductive logic. Area of analytics uses modeling, risk modeling, actuarial modeling, modeling for investments. Inductive logic requires some type of expert experience, judgment, or opinion as part of the logic, the way in which credit scores were created, for example. Data usage, application of data as information. It's central to business models. Data may be itself a product or service. And data governance challenges include evaluating whether there are regulatory or contractual constraints on how data may be used, in particular, privacy data. And you have to ensure that these are met. Data publication, once you send it outside the organization, it's impossible to recall it, can't be corrected. So you have to decide how you're going to handle this if you have an issue. And data breaches also fall under this. Data archival, you have many rounds of usage and publication, and eventually the data reaches its life cycle. You want to copy data to an environment where it's stored in case you need it again in an active production environment, followed by removal of the data from all active production environments, the end of the retention period. Data archive is where you'd store the data, but you're not doing maintenance, usage, or publication. If necessary, you can restore it to an environment where one or more of these can occur. Data purging. So you come to the actual end of life for the data value. Data purging is removal of every copy throughout the enterprise, and that's almost impossible to do in today's world. Ideally, it'll be done from an archive, but data governance is a challenge, and it's being able to prove the purge was done properly. You can imagine if data is located in 50 different places in an organization, how do you control that? Requires a framework for enterprise-wide integrity. You typically would have an IT security group, a database administrator, a data owner, and a regulator, ensuring data integrity is met. You can't eliminate all vulnerabilities to data integrity, but your controls should be established to reduce propensity for data integrity errors and vulnerabilities. It also should integrate and coordinate the capabilities of people through a data integrity assurance infrastructure. Be part of a control framework designed to integrate the capabilities molded to fit virtually any organization. And you want to support the organization along with data management and governance to make sure you have enterprise-wide data integrity. It's a very steep cliff to try to climb. It's a very big ask, but it's something that companies are starting to work on more and more. You want a sound data integrity strategy. You want to design your infrastructure so that you can manage data availability, usability, integrity, and security. Data management is execution of data architectures, policies, practices, and procedures. And at its core, you're meeting compliance requirements, you're making data visible to C-level management, you're improving your operations, and assisting with efforts to fix data quality at the department level. A data governance team, you can create a strategy for how you're going to define decision rights, how are you going to manage all of the activities, developing and approving policies and procedures, who's going to monitor compliance, who's going to establish the service level agreements, protect the system architecture, manage raw metadata, manage security and access. And the factors for governance success based on very key factors: culture, quality of company culture, and decision-making process. Selecting the right business stakeholders to participate, considering industry best practices, having sponsorship for management, and having the funding resources to do it, and integrating this process with your QMS. So data management, 4 questions. Why is data required? How are you going to collect it, validate it, and handle it? 6 ways to improve it. Conduct real-time quality reviews, train for data and process management, automate data capture, drop spreadsheets for data storage, map your entire process workflow. That's where business process mapping is so important. Adopt developing industry standards. Put the best practices to work. So comprehensively assess your system and data to ensure the requirements are fully met and documented. Evaluate your practices related to data governance and management with a risk-based strategy, protect data integrity and strengthen the QMS. Comprehensively remediate compliance gaps that are identified and thoroughly validate systems to make sure that they are going to stand up and data is safe, reliable, and available. And data governance has multiple areas: data strategy, data governance, data quality, data operations. And these are all different and defined in different ways. They should be part of an overall data governance umbrella or approach to it. Others, platform and architecture, supporting processes. You have to be able to measure your level of maturity in terms of data integrity, compliance, data governance. So data governance is at the heart. It's the governance management, a business glossary, so people are using consistent terminology, and how you manage metadata. It provides a framework for dealing with challenges around data compliance and regulation, helps management make sure that the data is available, usable, with integrity, quality, consistency, and security. Meet compliance, component of an enterprise data management system. So if you have enterprise data management in place, those should be based on standards with a common vocabulary and terminology, common reports, standardized processes. Data governance can be leveraged in maintaining data integrity, managing data more effectively, having consistent data definitions. The quality of transactional and analytical data across the enterprise should be measured and tracked. More easily integrate, synchronize, consolidate data from different locations, exchange and transfer data in a common format. You want interoperable systems. You want data to be flowing in a way that's streamlined and efficient. Coordinating communication, providing insight, coordinating activities due to standardized processes, improving business intelligence reporting, reducing costs, and providing that single source of data to be used many times. Reducing costs also by eliminating redundant data stores. 6 key elements to data governance: organization, policies, principles, and standards, processes, practices, and architecture, investigation and monitoring, and gap analysis, tools and technology. And I'm not going to go through this in detail because we are short on time. But just the idea is you have an organization that has participation and commitment from IT and the business, executive sponsorship. Data governance board should oversee all data assets, sanctioned through a charter, and setting the direction, aligning business and IT goals. Managing it as a strategic asset, driving priorities in regulatory compliance, defined roles and responsibilities, policies, procedures, and standards, directing how data should be used, managed, and monitored across the organization. The policies, principles, and standard basically are developed to enforce data standards and governance procedures. Who's responsible and accountable for each of these things? Processes and practices and architecture. Processes must be established and formalized. Without formalizing, you can have a consistent, constant need for IT to demonstrate any value they're adding to the business. Setting formal processes and practices, identify and document how the organization manages its data. The organization has to define how the data is to be, how it's to be stored, archived, backed up, and protected. Practices and procedures instituted to ensure compliance. Data governance processes and practices to help you face challenges at an enterprise level for data integration concerns, and including enterprise standardization for data and systems. Data architecture, how data is organized and integrated, enterprise data standards, data models, data flow diagrams, and so forth, in addition to security and privacy. It's essential for determining requirements and preparing the organization for efficient and effective data integration. Data integration is cleansing, transforming, merging, enriching data, addressing error handling, scheduling, process restart capabilities. Data administration, gaps in data and audit, ensures that data is integrated in the timeframes required by the business and outlined in the SLA. Data cleansing, you're identifying data model schema differences, and you're validating the rules based on business user roles and processes, recognizing duplicate data, behaviors, and functionality, and eliminating that. Data quality, incorrect or inconsistent data, creating and managing data models. Requires creating enterprise standards. You can use a data profiling tool, data to be assessed for consistency, metrics to track the effectiveness, and continuous improvement. Examination of duplicate definitions, identifying consistent inconsistency, and becomes information knowledge sharing where definitions, data types, entity layouts, and domains are published and in sync with each other. Metadata, again, that's structured information, and it can include many types of aspects of the data itself, the lineage, the business rules, and so forth. If you have a data model repository for metadata, keep in mind there are differences across the organization, different applications and systems, different platforms and databases. Data contained in these may not be stored in a standardized method. Different meanings for data types, different data types and naming conventions. Some information may be manual. Investigate and monitor, looking at quality issues, prioritizing them, get to the root cause and do a corrective action, and decide on next steps, implement the fix and monitor results. And the gap analysis is focused on mapping the organization's governance policies and processes against industry standards and best practices, benchmarking. Allow the organization to have an understanding of where their organization is in terms of the maturity versus their target needs to be and the plan to get there. Tools and technology, considered and evaluated for use during post-implementation. So data profiling tools, modeling repository, workflow data management application. There are many ways you can do this to have better control over data. And the board can identify the tools and technologies needed, make recommendations, try to standardize the model, determine requirements for a 2B data architecture, an enterprise information model, and then also identify actions to mitigate risk and methods of communicating and training people. So part 5, this is the last section, and we're going to talk about vendor audit, FDA inspection trends, industry best practices, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So vendor audit, you have to validate systems. Vendor audits are needed to ensure quality control. It provides a company with a means to verify whether the vendor meets all the FDA laws and regulations. And the intent is to evaluate the quality management of the vendor, how they manage code from development through testing and support. You want to make sure the products and services you're getting are from a qualified vendor. For any system, the company has to demonstrate the use of appropriate technical and procedural controls. So the vendor's documentation may provide some of that. Companies typically leverage the expertise of other product and service organizations, like the vendors of computer system products and services, rather than doing that themselves as a business strategy. If you think about an on-premise server versus a cloud server, you don't have to do the day-to-day maintenance, keep the lights on with the cloud server. You let the vendor do that. You pay a cost for it, but it's a lot cheaper than trying to do that yourself. And also, you can never keep your system as state-of-the-art because it would be too much of a capital investment. But the cloud vendor can do that. Audit the vendor to reduce costs and improve quality, reducing duplicate effort. So if they have something they can give you to share, you can leverage it. Doesn't mean you're going to have to use it as is and just say this is all we're going to do. You reduce the duplicate effort, so you leverage what they have, but you may have to add to that or do something a little bit different. You want to clarify expectations with the vendor so that there are no misunderstandings or risks. Establish relationships. You want to be able to have a voice into the quality of the products and services they provide over time. And so in particular, you want a vendor that's in the life science industry. They have an investment there. Most of their clients are in that industry. Then you know they're going to have their ear to the ground for any FDA compliance requirements. Audit them at least every 2 years. Key areas during audit, you want the viability of the company, assigned responsibility and accountability, accurate system performance, the requirements are met, the system is suitable for intended use, and the ability of the system to maintain data integrity and to meet Part 11 compliance if applicable. The viability you can get from many different sources, but just to get an idea of whether or not this company is of concern to FDA, you can look at warning letters and see if the vendor's name comes up. Responsibility, you want to make sure there's good leadership, that there's key decision making. You can go to one person for a decision, and the culture of accountability so that all levels of the organization are accountable for the work they do. You may have a user group for your particular vendor product. If that's the case, it's a good opportunity to get additional insight from other users of the software. System performance, you want to make sure it meets functional requirements. And basically, the vendor should be doing what would be consistent with an operational qualification. But still, even if they do that level of testing, you still want to do your own. Data integrity. You want to make sure that the functionality can sufficiently maintain the integrity of the data, that you can meet Part 11, that you can meet data integrity requirements, that you have the right audit trails in place, that you're having your vendors following change control, formal change control, that they have security on the system. The vendor has to demonstrate that they did unit integration testing that was adequate, that they do formal change control. Patches, upgrades are done periodically, but they should be with coordination with the client. When they send you any kind of upgrade or patch, there should be release notes with it that you can read and understand from that the key areas of the software that have changed and be able to do your testing accordingly. Vendor may be doing data migration or conversion services for you, and you want to make sure that they're able to do that. They have to demonstrate their processes, procedures, and practices are based on risk assessment, GAMP5, and FDA compliance, Part 11, data integrity. Work done by the vendor has to be appropriate based on these. Risk is critical, especially to the degree of a vendor audit where it's determined based on how a company will implement and use the product, or what will the potential impact be on your system, processes, or organization. Just define the risk, look at the risk potential, and do more in-depth auditing in areas where you feel there's concern. Also talk about risk with the vendor. Talk about what ways the vendor has provided any features or functions that can help you mitigate risk, and maybe there are other technical controls that could be implemented. Send them a pre-audit questionnaire, relevant quality questions. You want to give them sufficient time, give them a couple of weeks to deliver that. And then based on the output, the response to the questionnaire, you might decide you're going to go on site and audit them, or maybe not. You want to research the vendor questionnaire on the vendor's website when you have cloud and SaaS solutions, where you can't go on site and audit the vendor itself. Understand their policies, procedures, practices, and certifications. Wear an FDA hat, develop specific objectives and expectations with a defined scope. Give them a scope memo. Sign clear responsibilities and match expertise to specific areas. A vendor audit should be done by someone representing functional area, business, and the IT area and the quality area. One person should be the point of contact. And GAMP5 or PDA Technical Report 32 give you some guidance on how to do that vendor audit, the key areas to cover. And they range from quality system all the way through maintenance and operations. And you want to verify those key areas. Make sure the policies and procedures are reviewed and approved. Training practices are sufficient and documented. Written records are available for the procedures they're following. They keep current with FDA industry standards, requirements, and best practices. And that documents can be available in human readable format. They're decipherable, legible. Be objective, gather factual information and evidence, verify information during interviews, ask questions while you're on site. Give them a constructive report focusing on the quality management program of the vendor, and understand their challenges and constraints. Make note of any continuous improvement efforts that they put forth. You want to wrap up and have a discussion with the vendor Every day of the audit, you should be doing a wrap up at the end of the day, a debriefing, where you give them honest, direct information and you focus on the areas that you're concerned with. Be willing to compromise where feasibility and cost are issues, but never when quality or compliance is at risk. Have follow-up questions and discussions. You may have things come to mind after the audit is done. Give them a draft report and give them time to respond with specific dates and make sure the commitments are realistic. Samples of typical deficiencies noted during vendor audits: weak testing process, lacking robust enough scenarios, not doing what's required based on the risk. Testing doesn't reflect your use of the product. Testers not trained or qualified, or it's not documented. They don't understand FDA GXPs. Their documentation is weak, missing dates, no segregation of duties. Change control is lacking or poor quality. And they may be using subcontractors that are not under their sufficient control. They should be holding their subcontractors to the same standard that you hold the vendor to. You can either use the vendor unconditionally for any product or service. You could use them for certain products, product versions or services. You can use them subject to corrective action that they have to take and follow through and make sure that they take those actions. You could also agree to re-examine the vendor in the future. You don't want to use them right now, or prohibit the use of the vendor completely. So when we look at inspection trends, we see that the basics for these inspection trends related to meeting compliance guidelines, focus on data integrity, Part 11 compliance, process quality, product quality. You want efficient business operations. Again, this is all about the company's image and reputation. And FDA has a lot of different tools available to them. The 483 observations on site out of compliance, the warning letters, and escalation of the 483. The warning letter can get escalated to a consent decree. You can even get a warning letter or consent decree right out of the gate if you have issues that are that egregious. Seizure, import alerts, injunction, criminal prosecution, and fines. Seizure and import alerts are important because most of the FDA regulated products are subject to counterfeit activity. And the counterfeit activity, not everybody knows this, but counterfeit activity, the revenue from that generally goes to support terrorism around the world. And so you want to disrupt and stop that in its tracks. So there is a lot of effort between FDA and Homeland Security in the US and Customs and Border Protection in order to be able to identify any products that are coming in that are counterfeit. With the 483 observation, it's an observed or possible problem related to anything in your organization: facilities, equipment, processes, controls, products, employee practices, records, paper and electronic. And those paper and electronic records support all of the other areas. And when we look at 21 CFR Part 11, you can note that up until 2015, most of the audits done were really procedural audits looking at SOPs. It wasn't until 2016 when they started really digging into the list on the right-hand side of all the things that are needed for Part 11 compliance. By 2020, they had captured just about all those things, meaning that they are certainly asking the right questions. And that oval on 2019 should actually be around 2020. Sorry for that. But 2020 is the one to highlight because that's when FDA really dug in and asked the right questions. And they will be doing that as they have gotten a lot more training. They didn't push for training at first because a lot of industry wasn't using Part 11 records or signatures electronic. So they didn't feel the need to do that necessarily, but now they realize that people are using this technology more often. Warning letters with data integrity citations, many of which intersect with Part 11. Here you see from a 5-6 year period, you go increase in the number of warning letters and the warning letters with data integrity issues. A lot of this has to do with the data documentation deficiencies that are increasing despite the fact that FDA has not changed its requirements. I'm going the wrong way, sorry. This is a specific data integrity violation where people are able to change master production control records who aren't authorized personnel. And there's a big sharp incline from fiscal year 12 to 17. And we see the same type of incline in the chart for data integrity related citations where people are throwing data away. They're not keeping all the data that's required. And warning letter citations. Most of these are related to process validation, data integrity, and quality control. And this is from 2010 to 2020. And again, import alerts, untitled letters, warning letters, and injunctions. The import alerts are important. They're just as heavily represented or almost as warning letters. And the import alerts are important to keep out counterfeit product. Industry is losing millions, if not billions of dollars a year to counterfeit product. The trends for recent warning letters related to data integrity in Part 11, not having control over access to computer systems, not doing things contemporaneously, deleting, falsifying, altering, manipulating data, not having your contract manufacturers held to the same standard as your employees. Specific areas, security and access, testing and validation, training and expertise, and documentation. And there's a lot of overlap in those. And what we see is recent warning letter trends, and I apologize for not having the source for this. I couldn't find the source when I went back and looked for it. But data integrity and rudimentary violations are both. You see 19 and 20 warning letters with those types of issues far outweigh all of the other types of issues that are going on. So people are getting sloppy. People are not doing things right the first time. With security and access, more lax practices, people are sharing accounts and user IDs and passwords, not putting rigor on security, giving people more access than needed, change control and audit trails compromised, not having segregation of duties, not doing sufficient testing or not testing, not validating the system at all, insufficient validation, documentation lacking, not doing robust testing based on potential risk, can't trace requirements. There's no traceability matrix. SOPs are not updated. With training and expertise, not making it mandatory or enforcing it. System steward, the IT person who does the maintenance of the system in a validated state, is not trained in how to do that for a GXP environment. Resources doing validation not being appropriately trained in how to do validation. Users lack training, and from that, they end up retreating and using their old way of doing things. They might want to use their old system. They were comfortable with it. You've got to make sure if you're putting a new system in that you have an inventory of all of the mechanisms used to collect that data to date, and you obsolete those methods once the new system's in place. You don't want somebody keeping two sets of books. And your internal auditors, your quality organization has to understand validation in order to serve the organization effectively. All the training records, the resumes and CVs have to be current and have to reflect the skills required to perform a particular role. Documentation, not doing the risk assessment or not having the GXP system inventory. Insufficient testing, documentation, not following good documentation practice, incomplete or inadequate training records. And from FD Asia, which was issued in 2022, the guidance from FDA, if you delay, deny, limit, or refuse inspection, the FDA can then deem every product at your site adulterated. And they can do that right off the bat if you try to put them off at the door. Contributing factors to trends, the regulatory maturity of the firms and the inspected firms and the regulators, investigator background and expertise, the culture and management oversight, prior history relationship with FDA. I had a VP of quality who had such a contentious relationship with the FDA local office, yet FDA dug its heels in and kept sending that same person to all of the locations for that company. It didn't do him any good to have a contentious relationship. Geographical location, worked at a company which built a tox lab out in the rural area in the US, thinking, well, the only inspectors locally are dealing with food establishments. And so they figured they'd be scot-free if they went there. They wouldn't have a big audit or any kind of serious audit. In fact, the FDA sent their best people there. Availability of required expertise. Not everybody is up on all the technology or the science, and so that has to be brought into the equation. And public information, 24/7 news cycles and social media influence the way FDA is looking at the world. So again, requirements for record retention and review don't differ whether it's paper or electronic. Paper and electronic data record keeping systems are subject to the same requirements. What is required for paper is required for electronic. How you do that, how you meet that requirement will be different on paper versus electronic. But start there, start with what is required. The incidence of computer system data integrity violations is at an all-time high. It's been increasing in a trend over the last 10 years. And here we see 2010 to 2012, it shows 5 warning letters with data integrity violations, yet 2013 to 15, there were 24 warning letters. So a huge increase in that time period. And FDA inspection trends, you can see this by citation. And so what they found was, depending on the citation, there were a number of warning letters having this type of citation. And so we look at just the first one. There information on the others, but just to look at one. The responsibilities, procedures applicable to QC unit shall be in writing. Written procedures should be followed. Relates to Part A, which states quality has a responsibility to review production records to make sure no errors have occurred, or if errors have occurred, they've been fully investigated. Too often, raw materials released to production, or some finished product is released to distribution. And in each case, the quality review of that information lagged behind. They didn't review it until after it was released. It's important because a lot of these production records may be electronic records, signatures, electronic signatures. You have incorrect dates, incorrect data, missing data, duties not segregated, and approval is not done in the right order. The chronological history of the data is not sufficient. Raw material, packaging components don't meet specifications, but they go ahead and use it in manufacturing before the quality results are in. And then when the quality results are in and it's deemed to not meet specifications, you've got to throw out all of that raw material and any finished goods you made with it. Procedure not followed according to steps, labeling incorrect, environmental specifications not met, error noted but not explained, no investigation of root cause, error noted but not corrected, or the correction is incorrect. Errors where quality review is done after material used, after product released. Procedure is not in writing. Procedures in writing but not followed in practice. That's where quality can come in and do inspections. Consequences, errors not found. That means more work is going to be necessary to correct things later on, if you're lucky enough to correct things before product gets out the door. Testing errors not found. Incorrect release of material out of specification. More examples. Lab results approved online, but the decision was based on something in someone's notebook or data record. Product released due to approval decision based on paper, but the system validation didn't include validation of printouts. Sharing of user IDs and passwords, improper use of mobile devices. Mobile devices should not be able to download any data from a server. They should be used simply to access a browser, get to a website where they can look at data online, but they can't download it. Global time differences, where you're not syncing up with Meridian time. Policies and procedures deficient, outdated, but you're using them anyway. Or you have them, but they're not followed. Internal audit is not done to the degree it should. Neither is training. The training records are deficient. You want to get buy-in. This is industry best practice. You want to get buy-in from senior management. Know your organizational culture. Can Part 11 requirements work here? Will people understand the new way of doing business and be able to embrace that? From a user standpoint, from an IT or other support standpoint, can this work in our company? Include business users, quality, and IT in all decisions. The three should be together on everything. Also, if you're showing users what a system does, have detailed scenarios. Let them play out what would happen under different circumstances. Make it realistic. And quality has to perform those internal audits, making sure the findings are set for remediation. You want to define the system of record and data of record and base decisions on these. Ensure the system of record is validated and maintained in a validated state. And validate consistently across the enterprise. Assess the potential risk of failure for systems in order to know how much testing to do. And base the approach to validation testing on a risk assessment and GAMP5 categorization, along with size, complexity, and business criticality. Have your inventory of GXP systems. If you have a vendor, you audit them every 2 years. Make sure audit trails are reviewed and that you have the records appropriate, that you have the reason for the change. In particular, people don't always enter a reason for change. Role-based assignment for access, security procedures that are monitored, monitoring activity for adherence to procedures, securing mobile devices and assets, making sure that they are secure and safe. Defining your system and data retention periods and adhering to those, preserving them through retention, and disposing of them securely afterward to reduce liability. Testing positive and negative scenarios, boundary and stress testing where it's called for, where risk is higher, and have that requirements traceability matrix. It's important to be able to show you've tested every requirement with one or more test scripts. Training should be mandatory and enforced. You can use online training to make it more self-sufficient. Identify those legacy systems that are going to be replaced by a new system before you put the new system in place, and make sure you obsolete those legacy systems. Do internal audits, document plans, deliverables from execution, results, and summary reports. Do it all in compliance with FDA. If you have a hosted environment, make sure the vendor is qualified, has a mature QMS, adheres to their own policies and procedures. Establish archival, backup, and restore procedures. Test those during validation. Make sure someone has a disaster recovery program, if it's your IT organization for an on-premise server or a cloud service provider. Business continuity program is something your business unit should have and should be able to test periodically. And basically documentation, because if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. So now we can go to any questions anyone might have and look at some any follow-up items. And again, if you want to have questions here, you can certainly put them in the Q&A panel. If you have them after the fact, please feel free to reach out to EAS training to the email that was given earlier. Send your questions there. If you have particular challenges, put them in writing and you'll get a response from me as quickly as possible.
All right, thank you very much, Carolyn. And yes, for all our registrants, the Q&A has been opened. So please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A feature. Now, the email address, we will be reaching out to all registrants with presentation materials and recording access information via email within the next week. So you'll be hearing from us, but if you'd like to reach out, you can use the Contact Us webpage on easconsultinggroup.com, or our email address is trainings, TRAININGS, at easconsultinggroup.com.
Just a clarification. So Part 11 is a regulation, not a law. It's actually a law. It is a regulation, but it's a law because you have to comply with it. And maybe somebody can respond as far as certificate of attendance?
We will, let me get back to everybody on that. Anything that we can provide, we'll let you know in our follow-up email for the first certificate.
And with Part 11, it's a law because you must legally comply with it, and there are consequences if you don't. So it goes beyond regulation. And I know I provided a lot of slides and a lot of information, and it can be very overwhelming. So please take a look at the slides. Please follow up with any questions you might have. If you have a particular challenge where you say, well, what do I do in this case? Certainly feel free to share that.
Our follow-up email will also include a survey, which we would appreciate everybody taking. So that will be coming out to everybody shortly. We'd like to thank everybody for participating. And Carolyn, thank you very much for joining us. You're welcome to stay on and answer some more questions, but we can go ahead and wrap up the webinar recording.